We're very glad you're here with us this evening. This week, informally at our staff, is called Watch Week because it's the week every 2 years when all of our staff from around the world come to be with the New York staff to help us pick the sites that will be on the World Monuments Watch. So right now, we're in the final hours of selecting the sites that will go to our external panel that will be announced on October 16th for the World Monuments Watch. And the Watch is one of those great opportunities for the staff and eventually the public to have the opportunity to discover sites that they think they know well, but they'll learn something special about them, and sites that maybe they've never heard about. It's also an opportunity to tease out a lot of interesting themes. And over the years with the Watch, we've looked at sites in conflict and the effects of rapid urbanization, and really just sometimes the changing political and social dynamics in communities. And our chance to talk about Cairo tonight, in a way, very much stems from the early days of the World Monuments Watch. We were started in 1965, but our very first project in Egypt was actually in 1996 as a result of the World Monuments Watch. So it was a site in Cairo that we'll hear more about tonight. In the time that World Monuments Fund has been working in Egypt, we've had 16 sites on the World Monuments Watch, and they've resulted in 22 projects in Egypt. And we've had an investment of $6 million in Egypt, about $2 million of that in the historic center of Cairo. And our speaker tonight, Jeff Allen, who's an American who has resided in Cairo for the last 20 years, has a unique perspective on how that city has changed over the last 2 decades, and perhaps has had a little bit too much of a front row seat because his apartment in Cairo is actually on Tahrir Square. So he also, I think, tonight will tell us a little bit about what the experience of the last few years has been as Cairo has grappled with the effects of the revolution and also the effects of the extreme downturn in tourism. I have to say that Jeff and I have been working together since 2008, primarily on a project at Babylon in Iraq. And but actually, our professional lives have intersected a couple of times before that without meeting each other. When he was a student at the University of Pennsylvania in preservation, and I was the executive vice president of the Crest Foundation, we were supporting a project in the medieval center of Cairo, working on the Ayyubid Wall. And Jeff was one of the graduate students we supported. And although we never met, that was really my entry point into understanding that there are places in the world that we understand because of their iconic spaces. So we think of Egypt and we think of the pyramids, we think of India, we think of the Taj Mahal. But often, once we get to know cities, we realize that those iconic sites only tell us so much. And often, it's the vernacular buildings of a city that really tell the story of its history. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to tell us a bit about Cairo.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much. As he mentioned, I've lived in Cairo for a long time. And just a quick story. Often you get in a taxi in Cairo, and there are 3 main questions a typical taxi driver asks you. He'll come up to you and say, "What is your name?" So you say your name. And then the next question is, "What's your religion?" Okay, this may seem odd to us, but this is the way Egyptians tend to think. They're trying to understand where to put you in an understanding of you as a person. And then the classic is always, they say, "You speak a bit of Arabic. You've been in Cairo?" And I said, "Yes, 19 years and some odd months." And then the next reply back is, "Do you like it?" Then I'll say, No. I'm going to speak, and this is unscripted. Okay, for the most part. And I'm hoping that you're going to ask me questions along the way. So if you have a question, and if we can answer it in a quick way during the presentation, please do so, okay? And then at the end, we can go into much more elaborate discussions if you like. Again, remember, I'm a foreigner living in Cairo, so I have a very foreigner's perspective on Egypt. But I also worked with a lot of Egyptians for many years on projects. So it's important to kind of understand the way people think on projects to better execute a process that engages them. And this is the kind of work we're doing now presently at several sites in Iraq, in Myanmar, and Thailand, where I work with WMF. So the origins of the way I think and implement projects now comes from this experience in Egypt with Egyptians. So the city victorious. Cairo is a corruption of an Arabic term el-Qahira, which means the city victorious. There are a lot of stories about why it's called that, but one of them is that when the Fatimid emperor rode into Cairo, it was July, and that's the month of Mars. I got that right? Yeah? So this is connected to that because of the terminology. The city victorious refers to the Mars and a lot of the issues of the conquering God, so to speak. There are other versions people say about what that means, but that's one version. And there is Cairo, 20 million and a half people now. It's a big city. This is actually from El Azhar Park, overlooking a direction towards the west. And this is the skyline in the background. I don't know, has anyone been to Cairo before here? Anybody an expert in Egypt or a specialist in it? So I can be careful how I step with my language. Actually, Zamalek is over here. The pyramids are this way. This is Cairo Tower on the southern end of Gezer Island. Downtown is this way right through here. And my house at Tahrir is right over there next to the Ramses Hilton. And this is Double Ahmar, the area we're going to talk about mostly today. That's right in front of you here. Qanat Tahili is right over this direction, which is the famous tourist market area. This gives you just the basics. Okay, we could go on for hours about Cairo, what it is, how big it is. 20,500,000 people. In 1950, the population was a lot less than that. Okay, 2,500,000. In 1900, it was about 1 million. It was about getting up towards that amount back in the 13th, 14th century. But they had a plague. Plague wiped everybody out. And it never came back with its population until the late 19th century that was similar to what it was several hundred years before. It gives you the size in general. It's a big place, okay? It's the largest city in Africa and has all the problems that go with it. Huge traffic problems, huge pollution problems. Unemployment is high. There's a fair amount of frustration. Most of the people in Cairo today are immigrants from the countryside. They bring a different sort of rustic values into the city. You can ask somebody from here where he is from, and he will not say he's from there. He will say to you, I'm from Asyut, I am from Enna, I am from Aswan. Egyptians' hearts are not really in Cairo for the most part. They're back home with their family relations in the villages they're from. They're in Cairo because they have to be. They have to have work. They have to feed their families. A high rate of poverty. Over 35% of the population is illiterate. So it's not easy to be an Egyptian. And we know their frustrations do build up occasionally. So this is a picture of the Nile Hilton, which is being converted, at the time being converted into a Ritz-Carlton. By the way, one of the 3 great hotels, mid-century hotels that Hilton Hotels built. One was in Tehran, one was built in Istanbul, one was built in Cairo. That's been recently rehabilitated. This is Mr. Hosni Mubarak's party house. This is the NDP, National Democratic Party's offices that are burning on January 29th in 2011. This is after a very violent day before, which brings on the Arab Spring in Cairo. All of this pent-up frustration of what it is to live in Cairo overflowed on that day. And from there on out, we had a period of unrest. Basically 2 years of great unrest during a military control of the country that stepped in. It was a popular uprising that ends with a military coup, and then there is a second military coup a couple of years later when the Muslim Brotherhood is removed, and today we have the present government of Rais el-Sisi. And you can see the burned out hulk there. On that day, it was a rather interesting experience. I must digress slightly. Heba Badr, who worked with us on the Babylon project, was our GIS specialist. And we used to meet at a little restaurant called Gropey's, which is an old colonial throwback place that nobody goes to anymore except Heba and I to meet. And we were supposed to meet on that morning. And we go in the morning to meet them. We're going to spend like 5 hours normally talking about Babylon, putting together our site management plan documentation. And we understood the day before when there was a bit of a protest that things were going to kick off on Friday morning. So we said, let's cut our meeting short and let's go home around 11, 12. I was supposed to call Lisa for a phone call. So Heba, she got in her car and drove back home. I got back on my bike and I rode through town. I saw these large gangs of people, men wearing long overcoats, carrying axe handles and metal crowbars under them. These are the goons of the military who are out there to face off with protesters. So there's just gangs of them standing around the corner, and you just kind of wiggle through in your bike. So I come around the corner of my flat, because I'm on this side, I'm actually behind the police lines. So when I pull up, there are these lines of police, all in black shields and truncheons and battle gear on, and I said, apartment up there, pulled out the keys, jingled, live up there, right? There are times when you forget Arabic, just be a dumb foreigner. So I got behind the line and I thought, wait a second, I'm not going to be able to make that because they turned off the internet. So I hustled over to, I think, the Central, which was still on the phone in Tahrir, and I made a phone call to someone saying, I'm not going to be there for that meeting later. We didn't have internet for 2 days. I didn't get out of the house until that night after they trashed the square. Now, why is all that happening nowadays? Well, look at all this. Satellite dishes on everybody's houses. This is in Zamalek out my friend Andy's balcony. And Cairo is full of people now, and they've all got access to news and information. And that means that they're tuned in. It's not like in the old days when these regimes could really clamp on somebody, control information. That means Egyptians, the young Egyptians, are completely different people. There's a different time happening, and whether we like it or not, the present regime is trying to restore the old days of Egypt under the Nasser period and a revival. But the people aren't the same. They're not the same. They're communicating a different way. They're experiencing things different. I think that opens up opportunities. Now, we know that we may not like what's going on in Egypt with the government, but there are opportunities for us to re-engage with Egyptians in a different way. And I think there's an opportunity to do that through preservation. So this just gives you the names of Cairo. It's got lots of names. All these sorts of names you can see here. Everybody's got a different name. This is an interesting fact. The fact the city is so old that when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, Cairo was already older to him than he is to us. Right? This is going to be your maybe 2-minute history lesson that I can give. These are all the different periods of people that have been occupying or had a role in Cairo. And so it dates back to the Pharaonic period. They were there forever, since like 4000 BC. And it goes through all these various periods. The Romans were there, and they set up a settlement called Babylon because they made a canal that went to the Red Sea, and they had a gate there, the Bab, and that was where they controlled access. That later becomes a place we call today Coptic Cairo. You have an Abbasid period. Umayyads are there first. The Abbasids come. They put in a guy named Tulun ibn Tulun. He liked to sleep on a bed of mercury, supposedly, because he thought it was very comfortable. He built a very famous mosque in Cairo. He's eventually pushed back out. The Abbasids come back. Eventually, you have the Fatimids, the Ayyubids, and then you have the Mamluk period, the Ottomans, the Qadais, which are the descendants of the later Ottoman period, and they have a particular title. They eventually become the kings of Egypt in the 19th century and 20th century. Then you have Napoleon. He pops by for a few years, leaves a big impression on the city for a limited amount of time. The British colonial period, very small. The Muslim Brotherhood, 1 year. And then the Egyptian military is back in power. Now, but, I was thinking about a lot of things, because I know we talk about mid-century program, and I'm thinking of all the Nasserite architecture that's mid-century. There's kind of some cool stuff going on in Cairo in the 1960s, like a lot of Africa. These societies were looking at ways to express themselves in their independence. And I looked at Pharaonic period across the river, the Roman stuff. But when I came down to what we've done as an organization, we've concentrated in one particular period. and that period is the Mamluk period. And that's what you see when you go to Cairo today, the old city. Although that city was founded basically by the Fatimids, the way it appears today with its monuments is the vast majority of them are obviously Mamluk. So 600 monuments registered in Cairo, 450 in the old city, the vast majority Mamluk. So this is a map that one of Napoleon's people made of the city. There were a number of different maps, but this map's particularly interesting. You know, Napoleon came for about 5 years. He fought something called the Battle of the Pyramids, which was not at the pyramids. It was fighting the last remaining Mamluks. And there's a famous paintings of him leading a charge, like this with the pyramids in the background. Never happened because they were about 20 miles away in a place called Mbaba. But they eventually set up shop. And what Napoleon does, he brings out this group of savants, and they start recording everything about the Islamic city. Everything, all the mannerisms, the habits, the buildings. They're in 5 different old houses in Cairo, and they're just recording information. And they produce something, and I won't try to butcher, my French is not good, but Description of Egypt. And this is an 1809 map. You see there was a lake there, that later fills in. This is Ibn Tulun's mosque, the guy I told you he'd like to sleep on Mercury. And this is Ezbekaya. And there was a city wall basic here. This area here is called Double Ahmar. This area is called Gamaleya. They're the north and south parts of the old city. This is basically the city of the Mamluk period. This is the citadel up here, which is an Ayyubid construction. And the actual Fatimid city was roughly like this. And then it just extended down from there.
Sorry, quick question.
Sure.
So you said Cairo is the biggest city in Africa. So what do the people in Cairo really feel like? Are they considered themselves Africans, Egyptians, Arabs? Like, is there a commonality?
It's all flexible. First and foremost, they see themselves as Egyptians. They feel themselves as unique. Their head of the Arab League is there in Cairo. They are often, because of the Nasserite period particularly, this was the center of the Middle East and the Middle East movement that was going on. At one point, Nasser tried to form a country of uniting Syria, Jordan, and Egypt into the Arab Republic, which failed very quickly, miserably. But in general, if you talk to an Egyptian, you'll say, "Ana Masri," which means I'm Egyptian. So Mas means encampment, means Egypt. Quite often, they also refer to Mas as Cairo. It's the center of everything for them, because you get to go there for work and whatever. But in general, they see themselves as Egyptians. They play in the African Cup when it comes to football, and they win many times in that. But they see themselves as Egyptians, really. They don't see themselves as somebody else, because they look back at their history, and they say, hey, look at the pyramids, okay? They feel that very strongly. Dunya is the terminology for mother of the world. Mother of civilization. That's what they see themselves as. So they have a particular pride in their identity, which I think is quite unique amongst a lot of the Arab world because of this lineage they look back. So that kind of answer it?
Yeah, thanks.
So using this map, this is a map from the 1930s. This is before all things went wrong, basically, with bad planning. But this is the city of Cairo as it stood in the 1930s. This is downtown. That area I just showed you that the French cartographer made is basically this area. It's just spun sideways. So now I'm turning it up north. It's being up now. And this is the historic city, the citadel down here, and the central city here. All of this, okay, Cairo goes out to here now. The pyramids are over here. Cairo goes way out here. It goes back over here somewhere now, and it's probably about 60, 70 miles long of development on the river both directions.
So the population at that point was about what?
1930s, it would be about 3 million maybe. Something, what did I say earlier? It was 2.5 million. Yeah, about that, something like that. So this is when it was very under control. There are some great old photos you can see of Cairo, and the Egyptians will pull them out. Because every once in a while somebody gets this moment like, oh my God, what happened? And there's one of a square near my house that just shows this beautiful space with fountains, and everybody's all orderly like this. No one has a headscarf on. Everybody's standing and waiting for the buses. Streets are swept. And then there's a photo of it. Complete lunacy. Now, Assisi has tried for propaganda reasons to clean up downtown because after the uprising, depends who you talk to. Some people call it a revolution if they want to feel good about the experience. After the uprising in 2011, the city went into a real mess. It was a complete mess. Filthy, dirty, it was run down. And Sisi has tried to rally everybody to feel good about Egypt. The country's bankrupt, but feel good about it, let's clean up downtown. So one of the good parts of what's happened is downtown has come back a bit. It's cleaned itself up. That hasn't translated in some of the other areas of the city, obviously. So this is a city that has these axialities put in the 1860s by Khedive Ismail, who looked at Paris and said, I want Cairo a European city. So he built a large palace over here, and he put in all these axialities. He basically punched streets right through the middle of the urban core, destroyed a lot of monuments in the process. So again, this is Double Ahmar right here, and this up here is Gamaleya. So the old Fatimid city would be right here, and then you've got all this area, which is basically the historic city that we're looking at today. So I'm going to stop in a minute, and you're just going to look at pictures. And you can ask me questions along the way. You can say, can you go back to that picture? Can you pause for a moment? Please feel free to say that. This is just a typical scenes of Cairo in the mid-20th century. These are by K.A.C. Cresswell, who did some wonderful drawings of Cairo. It showed you the typical landscape of the city before the big push of its development and let's say this rapid population growth. And part of that process was a bit of clearing. So before the Egyptian government was formed, that we know today since 1952, before that, during the colonial occupation of the British, there was something called the Comité. And the Comité was a French-British organization that dealt with the preservation of history in Egypt. That later becomes what we know today as the Supreme Council of Antiquities and the Ministry of Antiquities, which runs all the sites in Egypt. But this kind of shows you what they did. So this is the northern city walls. This is the Mosque of Hakim. And this is a clearing. So they went ahead and cleared the city. And they tried to define some of the Islamic monuments for better presentation, but they created these huge dead zone problems. Even today, this is still a problem in this area. And of course, you lose all this beautiful urban fabric in the process. This project is something that World Monuments Fund had something to do with. This is the mother of Shaban built this mosque. And Shaban was very famous as Sultan who produced these fantastic Qurans, these frontispieces, just amazing collection of them. And she built this mosque for him and her. And this is on Double Ahmar Street. This is the way it looked back in the late 19th century. And this is what it looks like today. As you see, that minaret was repaired. This was a WMF co-funded project with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. So the mosque has been cleaned up. The street has got all modern buildings on it. There's very few historical buildings still left in the residential format. So what's happened, particularly since the uprising 2011, has been that most of the residential units of historic age have disappeared. Since 2011, at an incredible pace, if they're not a registered monument, they're gone. And in the first month since of the uprising, it was reckoned that there were 30,000 illegal housing constructions in Egypt in 1 month, because everybody knew there was a gap. There was a loss of rule of law, and they were going to exploit that. And that meant building up next to monuments. We had a monument we worked on there, Aslan Mosque, that suddenly has a 14-story building right next to the minaret, even though there's supposed to be a 15-meter buffer zone. The Antiquities Department was powerless to stop this. They did stop a lot of destruction of monuments. Some registered monuments did get destroyed. A lot of them got looted and still get looted today. But mainly what was lost were these types of houses, these Ottoman age houses. They're almost all gone. Almost all gone. Really difficult to find them. They're under private ownership if they still survive, and it's rare that they're still there. So this is where I stop yakking, okay? So I just kind of thought about this a bit, and I wasn't going to give you just a roll call of monuments, but I want you just to get the feel of why these buildings are so important. What are the intrinsic values? Why should we care about Mamluk monuments? So go ahead and ask a question. Ask me to pause if you want, okay?
Why should we care about the monuments?
Pay attention, son. I heard gorgeous. That one goes back.
That door is inlaid with ivory.
This is a minbar inside a mosque. So at the, let's say, Friday prayer, you have a Sheikh Imam that ascends a series of steps, a staircase up, and sets and does the services from a position of higher up above the audience. And many of the minbars are decorated with this kind of inlay. This is really, really Egyptian, this kind of inlay. Sometimes there's mother of pearl in it as well. Prime candidate for theft. A lot of monuments had these stolen recently.
Is it?
Sure.
Is it the picture before? I'm not clear. Do you actually walk on it, or is it a ceiling?
Oh, it's a vertical.
It's a vertical.
It's usually as a panel. I'm sorry, I should remember. So you have a staircase that goes up, and it has these decorative side panels to add elaboration to the steps going up.
These photos are current state?
Yeah, some of them, if some buildings have been repaired. I'll give you an example. Oops, somebody tore that stuff out. Turquoise got yanked out.
Yeah, right.
This is Sultan Hassan Mosque, by the way, the biggest of all great monuments of Mamluk. You'll see a picture of it later. It's a Sheikh Moyed. This is the gate, the door entrance to Sheikh Moyed Mosque. And one of the processes of the Mamluks was to recycle building materials. So in a lot of the mosques, particularly the ones that WMF worked on at Cairo Bay as an example, to enter into it, you step over a pharaonic stone. So a lintel from a pharaonic temple went on the floor, so you step over this large pharaonic piece of material on the ground. And this is Roman columns that end up in buildings here. You know what Muqarnas is? A sort of transitionary architectural feature from round surfaces to flat walls. This, by the way, is a building that was a watch site. This is Cairo Bay Wakela. This is a monument called the Seven Sisters. This is just outside of the Cairo. They are actually they were Fatimid tombs that later became Mamluk. I was tempted to put this on the watch this year. And this is the granddaddy of all Mamluk buildings. So although Sultan Hassan is the big, enormous building, the Mausoleum of Cairo Bay is the quintessential best expression by most anybody who will talk will agree of Mamluk architecture in a single building. It's on the 50-pound note.
Are these mosques still being actively used?
Some are not. It varies. This is Aslam Mosque. This is a project of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture through a grant from the U.S. It was through RC. I think it was ambassadors. So it was a small grant, and then it was an RC second grant, which is something else. And this one has been restored. So a lot of this tile work had fallen off, and then it was put back. Pieces were found and put back. And in some cases, only one of these is original. These were added later to restore a sense of form to the building. In this case, the Mamluks had large territories east of the Mediterranean, and they were tapping into Persian artisans that were brought to Cairo. That's where you get these colored glazing surfaces that you wouldn't see normally in Egypt. This mosque is a building that you think that's really old. It's not. This is a mausoleum to a particular sheikh, Rafai, and this is a building where the Shah of Iran is buried. Amongst him are also all the kings of Egypt from the 1800s to 20. So, but this is a revival. This is a Christian who designed this building. It's a revival of Mamluk art forms in the early 20th century. Notice the ceiling? Ceiling? Skip the lamp. Lamp is some cheap replacement later on. It's the ceiling. This is a beautiful piece here. This is Ottoman Mosque. It's a really wonderful piece. It's making stone from the concept of carpet. So it's a vertical hanging carpet of a sort of soft architecture being incorporated into a stone material.
When did the Mamluks rule?
Well, let's copy the exact numbers, like the 13th century or something. What are they? They show up, establish a capital in Cairo in the 13th century. It's 1200 and some. They chase the Fatimids out. Well, they don't chase the Fatimids. They come in after the Ayyubids. Saladin chases the Fatimids out. Saladin dies. He dies, I think, at the particular point where they're fighting the Crusades in the northern part of Egypt. Because King Louis, Saint Louis, was up he gets captured at that point. Then once they get him, they don't know what to do with him. They put him in a barge and kind of figure out for a few days and bargain him, and he eventually gets freed. This is Sultan Hassan's mihrab in the end. Really stunning stuff. He's a clever guy, all right? So he's super powerful. He's a sultan. He creates this ginormous mosque. And then he puts his tomb in it. But where does he put his tomb? On the other side of that wall. So when you pray towards his tomb. Clever guy. This is Sha'i Mosque. This is another beautiful mosque on the money currency. This one is further up in Gamaleya. This has been restored, this building.
What's that in the middle?
That is the ablution fountain. You've got to wash your feet before you pray. You go in there and do that. But look at the marble, the use of marble, what they were thinking, what they were doing. It's really quite unique. And this is one of the commercial houses that was restored. This is in Gamaleya as well. This is used by the Ministry of Culture for special events after it was restored. These are called mashrabaya windows. So these are, yes, sir.
Can you quantify in terms of the importance major institutions involved in restoration?
Yes, I can.
The government, the Aga Khan Trust.
So this will lead to why we're going to talk to you about the building we're going to talk to you about. In the 1992, there was an earthquake in Cairo, 6.3, 6.9, something like that, causes a lot of destruction in Cairo. And buildings fall down everywhere. 600 or 700 people died. And there was a call, because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, to come to the aid of Cairo. At that time, the Supreme Council of Antiquities was under the Ministry of Culture, organized some programming, and a lot of foreign international groups came to do projects. Everybody was there in the late 90s. Everybody. From all over the world. They were all doing projects in Cairo, taking on sites. In parallel, the Ministry of Culture formed a special program called Historic Cairo, and they concentrated on the main north-south spine of the city, and they chose about 200 monuments. That was done around Zahi Hawass. I'm not saying I like Zahi Hawass in any way. It was Supreme Council of Antiquities. It was done directly through a guy named Mohammed Abdel Menaim. And they did a program of restoring monuments. Then they did it in a very aggressive, very fast way. It ends up in complete chaos. He goes to jail. Several other people go to jail because there was a lot of backhanding of cash back and forth on the process. This is one of the projects that WMF co-funded with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. This is the Mihrab and Minbar. Again, this is that Minbar. This is a modern version because the older one disappeared, but you can see the wood on the side of it. That's Shaban. This is Bab Zuwayla. I don't know if you know much about Cairo, but two big towers set at the south end of the Fatimid. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Like all these beautiful pictures you're showing us, there's hardly anyone on them. Are these monuments accessible to the general public?
Yes, they are.
Tourism? Yeah.
Yes, they are. They are. I was just trying to make you appreciate some of the artistic, but most of the monuments you can go into. Mosques in general, you don't have to pay a fee. And of course, if you're a Muslim, you don't pay a fee. But some of them you do. This one, you do have to pay a fee to go to the top up there. It's very minimal. This was restored by a USAID grant from the American Research Center in Egypt. This is Cairo Bay. This is a project of reconstruction of a minaret. Again, this is a WMF co-funded project with Aga Khan Trust for Culture. This is Al-Anak Palace. which was a project separately done by the Aga Khan. In the background is Shaban, which is a building I showed you earlier. This is all on Double Ahmar Street. And this is my uncle up here. Cairo is ringed with huge cemeteries. So you have the north and south cemeteries, as they sometimes call it, City of the Dead. So the cemeteries are these massive compounds, and they go on for miles and miles. And originally, they were just for the Mamluk sultans, and they were outside the city. So in the 1880s and 90s, you see these photos of this, and you see these guys pedaling by and camels kind of cruising by. And, camels didn't exist during the pharaohs. They came much later. So you'll never see a camel in an ancient Egyptian temple. So they were pedaling by, and there's all sand around them. Well, what happens is you get this period where everybody starts to want to be buried there too, particularly the upper-class Egyptians that come along in the 19th and 20th century. So now you've got these massive cemeteries, and then you've got all these people in apartment buildings living inside the cemeteries. And so there's this whole concept that these people have been there for years. Foreigners will come, don't kick out these people. They've been there forever. No, they haven't. They've only been there for like 30, 40 years, most of them. But they'll all tell you, I've been here since my granddaddy was here. No, you're an immigrant from the countryside. You wanted a free place to live, and you squatted inside the cemetery. But that's all part of what makes Cairo interesting, really. And this is a cemetery. So you can see these are tombs all in here, family tombs. They've got their family members, and you got somebody living in a house there. And this is the biggie, all right? So this is Sultan Hassan Mosque. This is the biggest Mamluk building ever built in Egypt. This was that little window I showed you, or a colorful bit of work. And this is Rafai. So this is like 1340 something. This is 1920. So that the Shah of Iran's in there, the kings of Egypt. The Shah, he was married to the last king of Egypt's, I think, daughter. I think he was. And so when the Shah was pushed out of Iran, eventually when he dies, he's buried here. And you have a little corner with the old Iranian flag and the Egyptian flag, and there's this tomb there. This building had another enormous minaret on it that went very high. And then one day it fell down on a lot of people. Killed dozens and dozens. But that's like in 14th century, way back. So it was a little shaky, fell over. If you ever go to Cairo, you must go to this building. It's a stunning, stunning piece of architecture. Go on the internet, look at Sultan Hassan Mosque. This is the one where the guy buried himself in this space, where the mosque is there, so you pray towards him. And it's got cannonball marks on it, because at one point the Mamluks, there's some cannonballs there. They were up here in the citadel where I took this photo from, and they were down there, and they were shooting a little battle at each other. Mamluks, I think only like a couple of Mamluks ever died in office. They were always killed. So if you became a Mamluk, you knew you weren't going to last. You're going to go sooner or later. It's just how long you could hold on. And this is when the Ottomans arrived. There are only a couple of buildings that look like true Ottoman architecture in Egypt. Even though they came and took over Egypt in, I believe, the early 16th century, 1517 or something like that, the architecture stayed Mamluk for quite a while after that. You have a little bit of influences that crept in. And they don't really change until like 1800 or so when Muhammad Ali arrives as an Ottoman Pasha. And here is Sultan Hassan and Rafai Mosque there. And this is taken from Bab Suwaila, one of the minarets. This is Double Ahmar, looking towards Al-Azhar Park, which was the preoccupation of me for a long time when I worked with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. Now, I have a partner who's going to enter the scene, and she's going to talk a bit about World Monuments Fund in Cairo.
Don't go away, Jeff. I'm going to be very quick so that we can get back to you, far more entertaining. So I was just going to give a little context for WMF's work. So as I said, the World Monuments Watch was the impetus for us beginning to work in Egypt. And our first three projects, the very first project was Kibbeh Sabir in Cairo, which was one of the sites Jeff showed you, and we're going to talk about that a bit more. The second project was another watch site, the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III in Luxor, and that's a phenomenal project that went on for many years, but a very classic archaeological site. Although very exciting finds, the colossi have been re-erected because they were found in the water near the site, and so many exciting things. And our third project in Egypt in that same period, 1996 to 1998, was some documentation, condition surveys, and conservation planning of the monastery of St. Catherine at Sinai. So we certainly entered Egypt with very big ambitions for what we might be able to do. And none of that would have been possible without the three funders who really stepped forward in our early days in our work in Egypt, the American Express, the Wilson Challenge, and Bernard Seltz, all who helped us really launch a magnificent program in Egypt. But our entry point in Cairo, in a big way, was really the park project that Jeff mentioned, which the Aga Khan Trust for Culture took on this project to create a magnificent green space in what had otherwise been a kind of dumping ground for hundreds of years. But that's the project that makes the news. But really, one of the great reasons for that project to be taken on was there was actually a tremendous threat to take down a huge swath of medieval housing that still existed in the neighborhood. And amidst that housing were many of these mosques and minarets that Jeff has shown you. And so while WMF in that era might not have talked a lot about the social impact of conservation, one of the real reasons to be involved in that project was to demonstrate that the core of the medieval city could be kept intact for the benefit of the community as well as for tourism purposes. So many of those early projects that we took on, one of them being Tarabeh al-Sharifi, one of the mosques that Jeff showed you, which was also a complex with a madrasa and water trough, was really a great demonstration that with a concerted effort, many of these sites could be brought back. And really, the crowning jewel was the completion of the Blue Mosque project, which, yes, miraculously was the last fully completed project as life was changing. And I think there's an interior shot of the mosque. Because from the outside, sometimes you don't really understand how beautiful these buildings are. And the partnership project with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture was not only about conserving the building inside and out, but it was also about reviving certain techniques that were really emblematic of this period in Cairo culture, but really reached their crescendo with the interior of the Blue Mosque. And there were a lot of debates about how to deal with infill. So all of the normal technical conservation problems were resolved. But I think here what you find yourself with is a beautifully intact interior, still very important touchstone within Cairo. And that really leads us to the project that Jeff is going to talk some more about in a few minutes. Which is, as we've been thinking about what our future should be in Egypt, and with, indeed, the uprising and the effects, and as Jeff said, there are now no longer that great richness of international NGOs working in Cairo. So in times like this, even if the conflict zone is not actually in Cairo, what you find is an incredible disinvestment in the city. And with the partnership of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and World Monuments Fund and others in that era, you realize that there's a reason to keep the historic center intact. And so with Jeff there on the ground and the ability to go explore the city more and more, we discovered that there was really a very interesting Sufi site, which we were fortunate came to us for deliberations for the 2018 World Monuments Watch. And while I can't reveal what the watch will be because we don't know that yet, we can at least say with certainty that this is one site that's still in play and under very serious consideration. And we've also submitted a grant proposal to a funder to talk about the ways in which this site might be catalytic. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jeff.
There you go. That's our idea. So, I think Lisa summed it up. We had conversations, and you know, if you live in Cairo and you suddenly see all this vibrancy and go into this period where things are down, and you think about ways of what you can do for Cairo to bring it back, and we think that there's an opportunity here to do a project that's, and someone mentioned earlier about the idea of where are the people and all this. This project has huge social ramifications and impact. The Tikkayat, al-Gulshani in the Double Ahmar, specifically Ibrahim al-Gulshani. So this is a Double Ahmar. This is Double Ahmar. This is where Kanakahili would be. This is the northern part of West Street. This is the north-south street. This goes all the way down to Ibn Tulun Mosque. And right here is Babzuela, which is a very central feature. And the site we're talking about is right there, in the center of it all, in the middle of the action. So if I spin that map around, where north is this way, this is the Tikkayat al-Gulshani, and this is near the Tent Makers Bazaar, Babzuela. There's a nice little Sibel Kitab that was moved back during the Komotei period. They often moved monuments. You know, that's a little too in the wrong spot. Let's pick it up and move it over here. So a lot of monuments kind of got shifted around. But this one stayed in its place all this time. It's an interesting format, and you can see with a central tomb in the middle and a wall around the side. This was a very, very important commercial area during the Mamluk period. It was a central market of a lot of different activities and materials sold, bought and sold. Today, it's a market area that's kind of in decline, but it still exists. One of the last blacksmiths that makes horseshoes is over here. There's a guy over here, right here, that makes butcher blocks. He takes old tree trunks and makes a butcher block out of it so you can whack away at stuff. Somebody over here has got mouse traps. Somebody over here is making little lamps out of alabaster. You can put a light bulb and it illuminates out. He makes some pyramids out of it. Somebody over here is selling shisha pipes, smoking the shisha pipe, all that business. It's an interesting area. And whenever I used to walk home from work, I used to walk home this way, I'd pass by this street. And I always saw this monument, but I'd never really gotten access to it. And walking through here, you could see something there that was really interesting. A lot of the old traditional crafts of Double Ahmar have disappeared, even the market areas, but this area still has it, and it's an area mainly made for locals. But you also have this tourist area right here, which is very famous where you buy these things called kayameyas, these big sheets of embroidered cloth with different patterns on them. So this seemed to be an interesting concept. And this is what it looked like back in the day, way in the day. So I'm just going to pause here and tell you about Ibrahim Gulshani and how I got to this point. So I went to the antiquities office, the local inspector, and I went in there, how are you? You remember me? And no, I don't remember. Yeah, but I kind of, okay, we talked the right language, and the next thing you know, out came the keys. So they said, let's go for a walk. So we took a walk. They had big keys. Do you remember Captain Kangaroo? And all you said, big keychain jingling around. So I had these two guys with these big keychains. And we went looking at monuments. And they kept taking me to Sibel Kitabs, which are these drinking fountains. I'm like, no, let's not even go in. No. And then finally we came up here, and I said, yeah. So this is how it started. And what we've done is basically we're chasing some money. Okay, we've applied for an application to the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation to do a documentation. We've also applied to a European Union grant. We want to find some money to restore this building, but this building is very unique for the photos I'm about to show you. Why it's kind of interesting and odd. This is the way it looked in the 19th century, back in the day when the Sufi shrine was still active, when there was a mechanism to support the facility. This is what it looks like today. It's a mess. It's a total mess. This used to be his tomb. It still is his tomb. But at one point in the 1830s, somebody covered it with blue tile, much like the blue tile you saw at the Blue Mosque. The whole front was covered with this blue tile. It was added later. This is built at the very end of the Mamluk, early Ottoman period, but it's strictly a piece of Mamluk architecture. So all of this gets looted in 2011. Somebody climbs up on ladders, as tall as the ladders go, and they pull off all the blue tiles. They steal them and sell them. They go over here, and there's a beautiful tomb here. They smash it to smithereens. They take all the beautiful stone carvings. Remember, 2011, 2013, there's a lack of rule of law, and Historic sites are being looted everywhere. The pharaonic sites, people pulling up semi-trucks, empty them out. It's mayhem for a while, and this place suffered a bit of that damage. Now, Ibrahim Gulshani, he comes from Azerbaijan. It's always great to me when you think about people moving around centuries and centuries ago. So he flees the Safavids. Sorry, you get the idea though. Safavids. He flees their persecution, and he leaves Azerbaijan, and he ends up in Cairo. And he's of a particular sect of Sufis, and he's there because there's another person he kind of follows. And he sets himself up in the little shop, and he's there when the Mamluks are still in power, but he's also there when the Mamluks get chased out. So the last Mamluk, guess who? Tarabai. He is the one that we restore. He gets hung up on the door. Okay, he gets hung up on the door. The Ottomans arrive, they basically hang him by his neck, I think on Mausoleum somewhere nearby here. And he's left there to rot for a while. This guy obviously was connected really well because he transitioned from the Mamluks into the Ottoman period very well and became a sort of cult figure for the Ottoman generals that arrived. But he was also able to marry Tarabai's widow. So this guy must have been very charismatic. He lived to be 100 years, supposedly. Now, he sets up this sort of cult following, the Sufi sect around him, and he has a lot of Ottoman generals that they're sort of mesmerized of because he's spouting off the right stuff, and everybody's really entranced by it. And at some point, the local first Ottoman governor comes in, gets a little nervous, and he says, "What are you up to talking to all my generals? What's your intent? What do you want?" So basically, Suleiman the Magnificent, who's sitting in Istanbul, says, come here. So he goes to Istanbul, they do a tribunal. Basically, Suleiman says, okay, you're cool, you can go back. But he takes all those military Ottoman soldiers and transfers them, just in case, away. So Gulshani builds this Sufi sect. He builds a complex. He starts building his tomb before he's dead. And he has this following. Supposedly, I read this one report that they would fight over who wanted to drink his bathwater when he was done. So he had this vibe going that was quite strong. And I'm not making that one up either. I read it in the paper. And it could be fake news, I don't know. He used to say to them, "You're going to love my bathwater. It's terrific. It's terrific." So the guy basically passes away finally. All the Sufis, when they died, they supposedly were buried in the floor of their cells. So there were 2 sets of apartment cells on each side, and then there was a large front building that was 3 stories long. After Gulshani dies, he's put in his tomb. His son lives up in here in an apartment. There's a mosque down here. They've got their whole setup in here. Every day they do this sort of ritual. I'm not a Sufi, but you know, there are the whirling dervishes. These guys got in a circle and they did a little swaying around with flutes and dancing. And they got into their trances. And they had a good time, obviously, because once they became a Sufi, they never left. They stuck around. So this site is in a severe state of decay. Now, we could say that this is bad news for restoration. But what we're trying to propose is an idea of something else, saying that this building isn't damaged. The Council of Antiquities tends to not allow monuments to be reconstructed. They tend to have issues with certain aspects of reconstruction and reuse, adaptive reuse of buildings. That's why this one's never been touched, mainly. It's a lot of monuments, a lot of mosques get restored, but this building has sat here all this time, partly because of the dilemma of these large voids around it. And what do you do with the place? It's not a religious center like a mosque. It has a mosque, but it's not really a Friday mosque. It's not a mosque that was meant to use by anybody except the Sufis. And so what we're going to try to do, if somebody gives us some money, we're hoping that the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation sees the good side of things. By the way, we were shortlisted out of 12 sites. That's why I feel good about it. For consideration, is work with the Antiquities Department first to document this building, draw it, figure it out, study it, stabilize it, stop it from falling apart, and then explore ideas of adaptive reuse. we're going to work with the SCA, the Antiquities Department, and have them part of the process of figuring out what to do with this building. And at the end of our first grant, we would propose it to the minister as a concept jointly together. We would also try to define a new level of methods of documentation standards for the Antiquities Department. And we're hoping that the European Union grant might help us to actually do the restoration of the Central Tomb. Huge impact on the local community. There's all sorts of people around here. Now, I was going to bring you all sorts of shots of people in the market, but I've been on the road since May, so all of my photos were back in Cairo, so I kind of didn't have those shots, but trust me, there's a lot of people around there. And we're looking at trying to figure out how we can integrate the community into the answer. In general, when it comes to monuments in Egypt, it's a top-down affair. But we're going to try a little something different. We're going to try to involve the Antiquities Department working with us side by side, as we've tried to do in other sites, and then try to get them as part of the solution of defining what to do with this site. Sure, that's a mausoleum. It has to stay that way, but there's a large area around it that could have some new uses that involve some of the craftspeople in the area. This has been demolished. As you can see, here's where all the tiles were stolen. There's a before and after. That's what it looked like before 2011. This is what it looked like after. This would be the central target of our restoration project. This is the front house. You come up the steps and go in. This is the mosque. It's a Mamluk era mosque that, from what we can understand, has never been touched. It's very, very straightforward. And inside, they built a shrine in the 1820s, 30s around Gulshani's tomb, and then they sort of pimped the ride. They did all this paint job inside, put lots of color inside of it. So it's kind of psychedelic in there, and that's a reflection of their Sufi ideas and the Ottoman period. Now, I've stopped talking. That is Sultan Hassan at night. And this, you could thank the Aga Khan for one day he was standing in our project site and he said, I want to see that thing lit up at night. So there was a whole project to convince the Antiquities Department to put a series of lights on that so that Egyptians at night, when they're in Al-Azhar Park, having a nice meal, they can look out and see that beautiful site. Thank you very much.
Imagine Jeff and I are on Skype together sometimes several times a week, and you can imagine that every one of those calls is extremely entertaining for me.
Well, there's a lot of stories in some of the scenes we work in.
So I'm sure Jeff would happily take some questions, and then we're going to invite everybody to have some refreshments and can continue the conversation. But I can't quite see, so right into the light. But if there are any questions, I see a hand here.
That was great. Thank you very much. So I was just wondering that some of the buildings that you showed, that the Gulshani, sorry, I get that right. It's obviously evidencing lots of different layers from lots of different time periods, and then latterly it's evidencing society's distress in the most recent episodes for the city. So I was just wondering, do you have a sense of what the attitudes might be when we talk about preservation or restoration, culturally, civically, amongst people who might be executing this work, to things that have been damaged as part of the recent unrest, which is a very specific moment in time, if that might be memorialized in, maintaining some of the loss of the fabric and acknowledging that it's been taken, or what do you think the attitude might be?
Well, I'm gonna, I think that, and Jeff can follow on if there's more to say. I think that that's a hard question to answer today, and that's part of the reason why, if we are successful with the funding request we've put into the Ambassadors Fund for Cultural Preservation, that's really the goal of that first phase of the project, is to really reach consensus about what might be the approach to be taken. I think our initial phase of work will be all about documentation of the existing conditions. And I think we've been having a lot of conversations about this all week long with the staff here, with different watch nominations that have to address some of these issues of reconstruction. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to depend on how the Antiquities Authority and the local community see the future of the complex of buildings. Because, you could equally make the argument that the blue tiles that were stolen were not original to the building in any case. So I think that it'll be one of these very complex, long discussions about what is the intent of the building. The mausoleum obviously will stay a mausoleum. The mosque will stay a mosque. But there's a lot of open space because this was once a residential community. So I think that there'll be a lot of decisions about how to address things once we have a better sense of the documentation and the current conditions.
I completely agree with all that. I don't have much else to say, but the decision of how we define a strategy for implementation is based on involving the Antiquities Department over a 2-year period. We need to build trust with them, build a relationship with them. Reality is, as civil servants, you're not going to get a lot of work out of them. It's a long story I could tell you about later about working with civil servants in countries like Egypt. But we want them involved in the process as best we can so that they take ownership and then that they jump in and help make these decisions about how to handle it. I may have an idea, and I do have an idea of what I would do with it, but I'm not going to tell them that. I want them to think about those ideas. We present the information. We present the opportunity. And then sometimes, people that you don't expect to come with an answer, but if you present the information, they'll make a very rational decision along the same lines as you would have done. Oops.
I think there was another hand. Yes.
The areas of this building that you pointed out as being collapsed, were they collapsed? Did they collapse or were they knocked down post-2011?
Mainly demolition by neglect over several decades and earthquakes. So the 92 earthquake caused most of these larger buildings to collapse completely. They were already in bad condition. The mechanisms for supporting these institutions disappeared with the arrival of the colonial period and the disappearance of the Ottomans. So there were financial mechanisms. These were tied to large amounts of property, shops in Cairo, and even land outside of Cairo that supported it. As a Tikkayat, by definition, it had these mechanisms that supported that. That all disappears when the Ottomans leave.
So is Cairo a big earthquake zone?
Yes.
So do World Monuments Fund projects include seismic retrofit?
It did on these minarets. These minarets, this minaret was intact. This was a wooden top minaret that was built, but the one that was Shaban, stay with me for a second here. I know that one had a retrofit of some kind on it because there was a lot of specialists involved dealing with the idea of earthquakes. No, I'm going a completely wrong way. Never mind.
That's okay. The other answer to that is that a lot of the buildings in the medieval section of Cairo and the historic urban center are actually all low buildings, most of them still built with traditional materials and traditional construction methodology. So many of them don't need seismic retrofitting because they were already built out of materials and in ways that inherently addressed the flexibility you need in a seismic zone. And as we've seen over and over again around the world, in historic urban centers that are in seismic zones, the worst damage is often to newer buildings, not older buildings, or buildings with cement-based additions. And so in this case, a lot of these buildings had not really been substantially altered and were also relatively, except for the minarets, relatively low to the ground. It's also a bit like New York. The buildings are built cheek by jowl. They almost reinforce each other the way buildings here in New York do in traditional 19th century blocks that are still evident.
Well, the problem comes in 2011 when you had this mad rush of illegal construction, because none of it was done according to code. So in a double Ahmar, in this area along Al-Azhar Park area, I'd have to find you a photo exactly of that area. In this area particularly, these buildings went up like crazy. All along the edge of Al-Azhar Park, high-rises went up. And none of those were according to code. And typically what I was told is that they are shortchanging on foundations, shortchanging on materials, rebar, and the structures. So the general talk is an earthquake comes to Cairo, and guess what's going to fall down? All this new stuff. And sometimes they fall down on their own. There's been a couple of them just fall over on their own. because they were so poorly made. There's 2 in that neighborhood. They were made since 2011. One of them is like that. People are living in it. I wouldn't live in that. The other one had to just be knocked down. So it's a disaster in the making, because a lot of this is going to be cleared out with a strong earthquake.
I think on the hopeful note that we might have a new project in Cairo in the not too distant future, I'm going to thank everybody for coming. And once again, note that none of that would have been possible without the terrific donors we have, and primarily in Egypt. That's been American Express, the Wilson Challenge, and the Seltz Foundation. And so, and then our lecture program is really thanks to the estate of Paul Mellon that gave us an educational endowment. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for coming, thank Jeff for his excellent presentation, and invite everybody for refreshments. Thank you very much.